Welcome to the American Art Collective podcast. I'm your host, Michael Clawson. I am in a guest studio today. I'm in Mark Sublette's famous studio that he uses for his Art Dealer Diaries podcast. Mark is, of course, everyone who knows he's been on our podcast many times before. This is, I think, is your third visit to our show?
No, this is actually my second. We've done a video. We did a little video on Navajo textiles, I think.
Right. And we had you on a panel as well. There was a panel.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
we were. Okay.
So numerous times Mark's been on.
Yeah.
Mark's on today to talk about a very specific person. I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Maynard Dixon.
I don't know anything about that.
Nothing at all.
I don't know how interesting this is going to be, but we'll see.
Mark, welcome back. Thanks so much.
Now, see, this is what you do when you're a real podcast host. You got to put on your lip gloss. I'm ready to talk. Yeah, no, it's funny. You know, it's an interesting concept because you called me and said, hey, I'd like to talk about Dixon. I'd like to do a podcast on you. I said, well, come down. You can have my booth. You interview me, which I normally don't do. So I'm sitting in my studio. But I'm the guest, so I get to talk more than normal.
You've graciously let us use your equipment. You're going to record this for us. No, this is great. We love having you on, and thanks for letting us use your stuff.
Yeah,
no
problem.
Great.
What would you like to know?
So, these deceased artists, we just don't get to talk about them enough, and it's hard to find experts. True experts. We've done a couple here and there. We did one on Lynn Drexler not that long ago. We've had some others. We've done ones focused on Sargent and other things. It's always fun for us to be able to really dive into a historic artist who's not around anymore, someone who knows them very well.
Right.
Mark, it seems like you're the authority on Maynard Dixon. And I know you probably can't say that yourself. Has anyone else done as much research on Dixon that's still living today?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Don Haggerty, and I'd say he's done way more than I have and has written more books on Dixon. So he's the guy, right? So, I'm under Don's, wing. Thank you, Don. So, I would say we're the two, individuals. He's an art historian out of Davis, and, he's kind of slowing down in that aspect. He's almost 90, and then I get to take I'm a young buck at 65. So
now Don's written. I know I have at least one of his Dixon books. Has he written more than?
Oh yeah,
he's written several.
Yeah, at least 4, and a bunches of articles and everything else. Yeah, he's really quite interesting.
Awesome.
So, but yeah, I know a little bit about him. I started, and I think you probably kind of like to know how I.
Yeah, tell us when did Dixon enter your life?
So really about 1995, 96 time frame is when I really started looking at Dixon. It was interesting. So I started my gallery in 1992 with Native American art, but I quickly went into, art, all types of art, deceased and contemporary. And I had people like Howard Post who came on early, and, I could see this imagery that Howard was doing and Ed Mell was doing and Ray Roberts were doing, and there was something there. And then I found out about Maynard Dixon, and it was like an epiphany of this guy's work. The first time I saw one of his paintings for sale was in my gallery. Jeff Mitchell had brought it to me. It was Late Light in the Catalinas, 1943. And I just said, oh my God, this is insane. This is so good. I'll never not have Maynard Dixon in my gallery. And I bought that piece. I ended up selling it at my first major show, which was 1996. And I bought it back probably maybe 5 years later for double because I wanted it back. And it's in my museum right now hanging. So, I love it. It's one of those things. It's a memory. And so that time frame right then in 95, 96, Dixon was coming up. He's born in 1875, January 24th of 1875, and he dies in November 13th of 46. So 96 and 46 are 50 years after his death. So it just so happens that 50th anniversary of his death was there. I said, well, I want to do a retrospective kind of thing of his work, celebrating that time frame. And again, I'm just learning, about Dixon. I'm doing as much research as I can. Don Haggerty's helping me. Don Haggerty introduced me to John Dixon, his Maynard's son, which was immensely important. It helped me, get credibility. It also helped me understand the man from a different kind of perspective, and also get material as well. So I did that major show in 96. I probably had 30 paintings and 20 drawings. You couldn't do that really today for sale. I mean, it's just impossible. So to think that I was able to do that as my first major show, and having 20 by 30, 30, I think we have maybe even a 30 by 40. We had, major paintings. And so that kind of kicked it off for me, that 96 show, which now is, almost whatever that is. 30
You say
years
impossible to do because no one's willing to part with that 20 to 30 Dixons all at once, right? Like they're just so rare.
Yeah, especially important Dixons.
Right.
I mean, you can have collections that would have a lot that might come up, but they're going to primarily be smaller paintings, they're going to be drawings and things like that. They're not going to be, big, important, the Lonesome Hills of Nevada kind of pieces, which we had in there, and those kind of things. They're just not, who's going to let them go? No one.
You mentioned his birth year and his birth date, January 24th, which means January 24th of 2025 will be 150 years.
Correct.
So it would have been his 150th birthday, which is a great opportunity, and which is why this number is what initiated this whole chat we're having. 150 years does not come around very often.
Nope.
And I think it's really neat that we can have this opportunity to talk about his sort of his role in the West, but not just in the West, but in all of American art and everything else. So let's dive in. Birth year, January 24th.
It was a cloudy day, Tuesday, I believe.
Where was he born?
So he's born in Fresno, right? And Fresno was, it had only been around for, I think, 10 years. And his dad was an ex-Confederate officer. He was from Mississippi. And a lot of those individuals after the Civil War went to actually California and in Fresno. There was a little grouping of there. So he went there. He was a lawyer. And, it's interesting about his father. He dies young. He dies in 1898 in the hospital in California, mental hospital, basically. So, and I'm sure a lot of that was PTSD that he suffered, and Dixon would have been around that and seen that. And that's going to really affect him.
Was he a veteran of some sort?
Yeah, Civil War.
Okay,
yeah,
Civil War veteran.
Yeah, Civil War veteran.
Wow.
And so it's going to affect Dixon in a way that is lifelong, I'm sure. And when he dies young, his father's relatively young, and Dixon's, 28 or so at that time, he looks for other father figures, which he finds in people like Lorenzo Hubbell, and especially Charles Lummis and a few others. And so these relationships with these other men that he looks up to are very apparent, especially Charles Lummis, which we can talk about now or we can talk about later. But it's an interesting relationship that he has, because Lummis is this bigger than life figure, right? So in 1884, well, first let's just say Lummis, before that, he goes to Harvard, right? He's an interesting guy. He knows Teddy Roosevelt. They're in the same class. And so Lummis in 1884 is going to walk 3,705 miles over 143 days from Cincinnati, Ohio in September to California. And he's going to write that whole time for the Los Angeles Times, give these little, updates of what's going on. But he interviews the James gang, one of the, individuals in that. He gets caught in a huge snowstorm. He breaks his arm. He spends time in his letter. Anyway, he shows up after 143 days. He gets to LA, and they make him the LA Times editor. This is the man who's going to end up being part of starting the Southwest Museum and different magazines and California Library, one of the main people in the California Library. So he's very influential. He's a big deal. And Dixon and he meet in 1895, and he will become a father figure. Dixon's going to call him, father, and call him, and Lummis will call him son, and for that component is really unique because Lummis knows everybody, right? He knows Edward Breen, he knows Charles Russell, he knows Douglas Fairbanks. In fact, Douglas Fairbanks is going to be one of the pallbearers when he dies on November 28th, of 1928. Dixon's going to be one of the pallbearers. Edward Breen's going to be one of the pallbearers. So he's this really important guy in Dixon's life, and we'll see that over and over again. And he has positive interactions, he has negative interactions with him. And so this is the thing about Dixon I think most people don't really understand, is that he's this unique individual, very creative, and I think he's also very introspective, very sensitive man. And he suffers, I think, from depression. They call it rheumatism at that time, but it's depression that he has. And he will have long periods of time where he's stuck in his studio trying to get over it. 1903, he goes to Mom's. He's there for 3 months. 1918, he goes there for many, many months. And, he has these components that hit him, and it affects him. And the biggest one of these, I believe, that really changed his life was on April 18th of 1906. That's the Great Earthquake. So here we have a man who's a very sensitive man, and you have this 7.8 trembler that comes through, right? Knocks him out of his bed. He runs out of his studio or his bed to go to his studio because he knows what's going on, right? This thing lasts 60 seconds. And you can imagine if you're very hypersensitive to all these sounds and things, you have dogs barking, gunfire, crashes, smells, burns. He's running to get to his studio. A chimney falls and almost kills him.
Wow.
He gets to his studio. He goes upstairs. He can see out his window the fire is burning and coming his way. He's trying to grab everything he can. He grabs all his blankets. He grabs his drawings. He lets the paintings go up in smoke. He can let those go up in smoke. They don't really, he can repaint them. He says, I can repaint them. And so what happens after that? Well, he does a little drawing, which is in our museum, with him showing him walking, at a brisk pace and very, doesn't look like he's, disturbed. He's got his blankets over. He's got the bison skull. He's got his drawings. And in the background, you see all these people screaming and yelling and fire. And so Dixon says, he goes, well, and this is the bravado that he's trying to hide. He says, I wouldn't have missed those 3 horrible days for anything. I learned more there than I did in 10 years. Yeah. Well, that's what he wants the public to see. The reality of it is, just a few months later, he writes Sam Day, who's a good friend and he owns a trading post up in Chinle, and he goes, I'm not a faker. I need to come out and spend time under your eaves and put my blanket. He really, you can feel in this letter that he's had some problems and he needs to get away from that. And he writes, even in that letter, he writes about Lummis. He goes, wow, Lummis came. What was that like? And you can, we don't know what that conversation was about, but my guess is that after that, traumatic thing, which is very traumatic,
Right.
3,000 people die, 80% of the whole city is destroyed. My feeling is he went to Lummis, which would make sense. He's a father figure, right? And told him how he feels and the things. And Lummis might have just said, buck up, dude, and that kind of thing. And I think it bothered him because Lummis goes out to see Sam Day somewhere directly after that. And by the way he writes that, you have to wonder. So I think Dixon, along with just, inherent depression that he has, I think that affected him. And I think he spends lots of time in the desert after that, especially. I think it heals him when he goes out there.
I'm curious, not that depression requires some sort of major event to
he had it beforehand,
happen.
I think.
Yeah, but I was going to say, though, is there something that happened in his earlier life that would set him up with this later on, or he just had depression?
Well, I'm not a doctor. Oh, wait, I am. But the reality is we don't know.
Right.
But I can say he was a very sickly child, right? So he has asthma, he's cachectic, he struggles with his health, which is going to give you anxiety. So, are there other things that go on? I'm sure there are. You have a father that was in the Civil War on the losing side. I'm sure there was a little PTSD on him as well, you can imagine.
Right.
So, I don't know how stable that relationship was with that family. I know he was very close to his mother, but I'm sure it was a combination of things and just maybe genetic. I mean, his father obviously has some type of mental illness.
Right.
And so, he writes a couple times. Dixon's right. One time in 1899, when he's working for the San Francisco Examiner's Sunday edition, he's the art director for Hearst. And he says, Hearst almost put me into the mental institution. So he's aware of it himself. In 1918, he writes Lummis after, 1918 is a very interesting time frame because in 1917, he gets divorced from his first wife. not an amicable divorce, and he's got a young daughter who's like 6, Constance. He goes to Montana to visit Charlie Russell. Charlie Russell's a very good friend. He respects him, what he has done. He meets Russell in 1908 in New York City, so he's known Russell for a while. Goes up. Great Northern Railroad says, we will pay you $5,850 to do 12 paintings. Come up and do it. And then he does, gets to see Russell. What happens? Conscription happens. World War II happens. We get into the war in 1917. The Great Northern says, James Hill says we can't buy these things. We're sorry, but we can't put them in our hotels. They took over our railroads. We can't do any advertising. Send them up next year and we'll see what we can do. He does, and he sells a few. We know of 5. But it made him so despondent that he divorced, war, he loses his big commission. He comes back and basically locks himself in a studio, and he writes, Lummis, who's the writer's father figure, says, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. I just can't do it anymore. I don't think I have it in me anymore. And Lummis writes him back, no, you're a young man. There's lots of time left. Thomas Hill worked until he's really old. You have some of your greatest works are still coming. Don't worry about it. You can do it. And Dixon somehow pulls out of that. You also have to remember in 1918, we have the pandemic, right? 50 million people are going to die in the world from influenza, and he's got bad lungs. So all this pressure is on him, and somehow he does pull out of that. Partially because he's going to meet Dorothea Lange in 1919. That has something to do with it.
Let's go back a little bit before we get too far, because I do want to talk about his wives. I want to visit San Francisco again.
Sure.
There's a lot. We've covered kind of a lot here. What was Fresno like when he was born? Was it still was it still the Wild West?
No, it's Cowtown. Yeah, I think it's like 1868 is when it's founded. So yeah, it's not been around even 10 years.
How long did he live there?
He spent his boyhood there, and he also would go out to the San Joaquin Valley. They had a farm out there. But yeah, he spent his time there. He also went to San Diego. I think his father had health issues again, and he's down there for a period of time. He really migrates out of there in 1892 because he gets to the school. This is the San Francisco School of Design, and he gets into that school, so he goes in San Francisco. And from that point, really from about 1892, he's in San Francisco till.
Is there any indication of what brought his family out west?
Yeah, Civil War.
After the war ended, his dad was just like, we're getting out of here.
So many did.
Yeah.
Right? There was nothing, right? There's nothing left in Mississippi.
What side did he fight for?
Well, he's in Mississippi.
Never say no more. He was with the South.
He was with the South, yeah.
He probably felt a little defeated, probably.
Again, he's in battles and things. I'm sure he needed a fresh start.
Right.
He's a young man, relatively young man, too. So he goes out, he meets Maynard's mom, who's an old California family. They've been out there for a while. I think they came in like the 40s or 50s or something like that. So, they come to California like so many people did, take your time, pick your country, pick your the Depression, right? Flows of people. Why? Because there's nowhere to go. Right, so that was the same kind of thing, I think, at that point in time.
And the gold rush, I imagine, is what
brought
people out.
Yeah,
that was sort of that wave.
That's
that they were
Manifest Destiny with President Polk, and the expansion of the West, and all that kind of stuff. And they have the gold rush at that time.
When's the first indication that art enters his life?
Early, 7, 8. He's already drawing. Yeah, he's drawing early, and he's drawing from life. He's doing. I think one of his earliest pieces was a ship of the Merrimack, and he's 8 years old. So he's paying attention, right? He's paying attention at 8 to the news. He's a very smart, erudite child who reads. As far as school, he probably doesn't go past middle school, but he reads, he writes. He writes in Spanish and English, so he is very aware of what's going on in paper and print. And that would bring us to Frederick Remington, which I think is kind of an interesting side note, right? He's the most important illustrator of his day right at that time. Dixon's aware of what's going on, and even though he's a young kid, right? He's 15. In 1890, he's 15 years old. December 29th in 1890, we have the battle, that's Wounded Knee, right? And right before that, Sitting Bull gets killed. So Dixon's very aware of that last battle of Wounded Knee, where Bigfoot and his people are massacred. And who goes out and does the illustrations for that? Frederick Remington. He does it right there, and just a few, I think maybe even a few days after, in January, and that gets put into Harper Weekly, all his illustrations. So Dixon, directly after that time frame, sends Frederick Remington his drawings, all his drawings of what these are when he's 15, he sends them as 16. And Frederick Remington, one of the greatest illustrators of his day, probably the greatest at that time, writes him back. And he says, you're better at your age than I was. Draw. Always draw from nature. And it's fine to be an illustrator. You're not going to get wealthy, but it's a good, honest life. You can have schooling, he goes. I had none, but it's not a bad thing, but you don't have to have it. And so Dixon's going to take that to heart. He's going to take that to heart for a very long time.
You said that was just after 1890?
So the drawings are done in 1890 and sends them in 1891.
So, they both would have, Dixon would have been younger, but even Remington wasn't that old at that point, right?
He's probably 15 years older.
Right.
He dies in 1909 and he's, 42 years old, so you can do the math. But again, Lummis isn't that much older either. All these,
right.
10, 15 years was a huge difference. Especially in those days, because you might not live fast, 65.
So the letter, tell me, because I've seen them either from you or the book, right? Probably both. The letter to Remington has survived, and the letter from Remington back to Dixon also survives.
So the letter from Remington to Dixon definitely survives. I don't know if the letter from Dixon to Remington does, but the other, and he wrote another one too. Dixon wrote another letter to him after that and said, how do you price things? Dixon's looking to become an artist at 15, period. Well, he's 16 at that point. And then just, the next year, 17, he goes to California School of Design, where, he's going to last 3 months because Arthur Matthews is this individual who's trained in Europe, and he's teaching him all these European methods and nude models. And in his mind, he's going, nature, Remington, and he's been doing this already since at least 7 or 8. So he doesn't see that as his route. He sees Remington as his route. And so he drops out, and immediately he gets one of his commissions. 1893, he gets his first commission, which is Overland Monthly, which, when you think about that time frame in 1893 for Dixon, right? So it's a depression. It's a world depression. So you have 575 banks fail in 1893. You have 15,000 businesses go out of business in 1893. You have 1/4 of all the railroads go in receivership. It's a very dicey time, but here he is, he's a young kid, right? 18 years old. I can do it. And he does. And so by 1895, just 2 years later, he gets the cover of Overland Monthly, and they write in there, here's the next Frederick Remington. So at that point, he has to be feeling, he's 20 years old, that, okay, I'm going to make it. I'm going to do well. And he does. He's really kind of a phenomenon right off the start. But like all phenomenons and things like that, they can have their ups and downs, and Dixon definitely does.
So he did some stuff for Overland. When did his relationship with Sunset start?
Yeah, well, I know he did. It's a good question. I know he did the poster in 1903, the most successful, and he had done stuff for them. I think it's probably about 1902, and when they have the great earthquake, he's doing things for Sunset at that time too. He does, there's no money, right? So it's 1906, have the great earthquake. There's nothing left in San Francisco. So he gets a few gigs from Sunset Magazine. He gets commissioned to go to do the murals here in Tucson, Arizona for the new railroad depot. He does 4 of those. And he gets paid $500 for it. But where's he going to go? Well, he's got to go to New York. There's no San Francisco. He can see New York as a place he needs to go. So he takes $300 of that $500, puts it into the Lincoln Trust, which is a New York bank, and then the Knickerbocker Bank falls. It's a trust actually. It fails. J.B. Morgan have to bail out the Wall Street. Stocks go down by 50%. Unemployment is 8%. So he goes into another time frame in New York where it's very difficult, financially, yet he does fine. And he gets tons of jobs.
Was he purely an illustrator at that point,
Yeah.
or was he doing any fine artwork?
He would do little things. I mean, I had a little painting that he did of a swimmer in 1910, and he did in Upper New York. But I mean, most of that time he was doing illustrations. He goes in 1909, he gets a trip out to Montana and does some paintings, little paintings and things of Montana. And I'm sure he's doing things all along. I mean, I had one of 1910 that he did of Montana, but they're more illustrative. I mean, he's married. In 1910, he has a baby, so he has to make a living. The problem is for Dixon, is that he's having to lie about the West, because what they want in these newspapers, or really magazines for most of the part, and book covers, is they want old West stuff, right? Gunfights and all the kind of things that we associate with the West, and that still is kind of around. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, I think they get killed in 1908, so it's still there in a bit, but he doesn't like doing all that stuff. He feels that it's just not true to his nature and who he is. So in 1912, Arizona becomes a state, February 14th. And I think Dixon sees the world changing pretty dramatically. I mean, in 1909, Orville Wright goes around the Statue of Liberty, and Dixon would have known about that. So he sees these things, right? He sees the West is changing. We've got movies, we've got, the Model T, now we have airplanes. And so he writes Columbus and he says, I'm done. I'm not going to write. I'm not going to lie about the West anymore. I'm going to go back. And so he does. He goes back in 1912, opens his 728 Montgomery Street museum, or his, it is a museum now, but his studio, and he'll be there until 1939, basically.
It's remarkable that the earthquake didn't sour him in any way on the Bay Area. Like he stuck around.
Yes, he's
that was home.
It's home, and in his mind, I think it could be rebuilt better. He did some illustrations for Sunset Magazine showing what it was and what it's going to be, right? So he's influential too. People know who he is. I don't think he even really wanted to leave in New York. There was just no choice for him, I think. So, I mean, yes, you're in Florida and a hurricane wipes you out. Yeah, you rebuild, right? So I think that for him, that was home. And of course, his first wife is there. Second wife is going to be, Dorothea comes from Hoboken, New Jersey. She ends up there. She's a San Francisco person. His third wife, Edith Hamlin, is a Californian. So there's a connection, definitely, for California.
So you mentioned the wives. Let's talk about his wives. I actually do not know the name of his first wife.
Lillian Westoby.
Okay.
Yeah.
How long was he married to her for?
Well, they got married in 1905 and divorced in 1917. They're married, by the way, under Loomis's tree, L.L. Saul, on May 5th of 1905. Still that connection, as well as Breen's wife, and Lucille and Breen get married in there in 1921. But Lillian has a drinking issue. She's an artist, but really it's the drinking that, destroys her and the marriage. Then he marries Dorothea, meets her in 1919. Dorothea Lange.
I was going to say, for our listeners, Dorothea who?
I think she's like Madonna in some ways. I mean,
you don't need to let
she doesn't. And in a lot of ways, she's a better known artist than Maynard Dixon, definitely worldwide.
When they get married, where is she at in her career?
She's just beginning, right? She's not. She's born in 1895. She's 20 years younger than Maynard Dixon. So, she has this interesting story too. Obviously, she's a very interesting person, but she lives in Hoboken. That's New Jersey. That's where she's from. 7 years old, she gets polio. That affects her right leg. She's going to have a limp, kind of a deformity. Her dad abandons the family when she's 12. So she's really has abandonment issues as well. And so she comes out first to LA with a friend of hers who does interior design, and then they move up to San Francisco, and meet Dixon not long after that. And he's been divorced for a couple of years, and so I think they bond over this kind of abandonment feeling and issues that they have. And Dixon's sickly, has health issues, has asthma really most of his life, not all his life, and they can relate to each other. And they're both artistically driven individuals. And then his third wife, and they're gonna stay married, by the way. They're gonna have 2 kids, Daniel and John.
Is Dixon with her when she does kind of the things that she's known for, the Dust Bowl images?
Yes. So the first one in 1933 is really her, the angel at White Bread Line, 1933, which she sees this lone individual kind of looking despaired with all these people ignoring her. Mm-hmm. She sees that from her window. And so they are together. She does that. Here's her first one. And then you have the 1934, you have the longshoremen's strike, which goes up and down the coast. And you have, all these people that are scabs, and you have this massive pandemonium. You have 2 people killed on July 5th on Bloody Thursday. You have thousands upon thousands of people on Market Street, that are really just, protesting. And so there's all these things, and that's when Dixon's really doing his social realism. He starts about 33, same time as she does, with the first little drawings, the struggle and some others. And by 34, he really starts to embrace that. His first one is a little small drawing he does at Boulder Dam. So in 1934. So yeah, they're together, but by 35, they're, it's over. So, but 15 years. And it was an amicable divorce. Right. It's just, she needs somebody that's not going to go out for 5-6 months at a time. Right? I mean, he goes and doesn't come back and doesn't say when he's coming back.
And it's sort of nomadic, right? He just kind of goes and I don't know when I'll be back.
Yeah. I mean, she says, I can't get him to leave, but once he'll put it off. Mm-hmm. And then he finally goes and then he won't come back. Again, I think this has to do with some PTSD and other things, that he needs that solace and that time away and just being with nature, and it helps him and it affects him in some way. But yeah, I mean, he goes on these long, trips and doesn't come back. And then, they start having kids in 26, 28. You got 2 little kids, and Constance lives with Dorothy and Maynard for a while. That's from his first marriage. So she has all these motherly duties that she's kind of expected to do, which I don't know if that's really her, forte, because she really is focused on being this creative artist. It's very important to her, obviously. So, when Paul Taylor comes into the picture in 34, he's an economics professor in Berkeley. He's stable. He's, by all accounts, just a wonderful person. And, she sees a different path, that she can be not Mrs. Maynard Dixon, but Dorothea Lange. And in the paper, she's Mrs. Maynard Dixon, but she's Dorothea Lange.
Yeah.
And so they both come to that recognition. In fact, Dixon is the one that says you probably should divorce and go with Paul. He's a better fit,
And then his third wife, you mentioned, Edith Hamlin,
yeah,
also a painter.
Yeah, very good artist.
He's very he's attracted to artistic people, it seems like.
Yeah. I mean, just think of all the artists we know that are married to, right. There's a lot out there. And because they're sensitive people, mm-hmm. too. And I think she could probably get his sensibility. And she really respected him, really loved. And, he had helped her with some of her murals that she had done before they even got married. So, and he's a bigger than life figure, too. I can see that. And she's born in 1892. So she's also like 28 years younger or something. It's a lot. But she can see who he is as an important figure. You have to realize he's an important figure in San Francisco, right? He's the one that helps get the Golden Gate Bridge over the the finish line, and it's because of those kind of things and he dresses in this fashion with this big Stetson hat, which was a Lummus Texas Stetson hat. He's got his cane, he's got a cape sometimes he wears, he has high heel, tooled Texas boots, he dresses in black.
And he just kind of has a look to him. He was kind of tall and thin and
yeah, he's
his mustache.
Yeah, he's like 5'11". He's not that tall actually, but he, with boots he looks taller, and and piercing blue eyes. I think he sees things like Georgia O'Keeffe and how she dresses and what she does, And he's not unaware of these kind of things. And he's actually kind of dresses that before even her, right? Because he's going to be in New Mexico in 31 for 7 months. So, and he was very familiar with O'Keeffe and Stiglitz. He went to New York and saw Stiglitz stuff. He didn't care for Stiglitz stuff. He thought it was some kind of hot, room art that was just more about selling and not depicting.
Well, hearing you say cape, I have this image of him in his mind, and the cane and the cape and his mustache. I mean,
right. And like the cane has a sword in it, by the way, which is in our museum, so you can see that cane.
You mentioned the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah.
Take us through that. How did he get involved in that?
Yeah. So let's just go to the time frame when that's going on, right? That's 1930. Mm-hmm. The Depression starts, the 24th of October, 1929, right? Mm-hmm. Everything stops for Dixon. All his commissions go out the door. He's only going to sell a couple dozen paintings in the next 4 years. So now we have this huge project that they want to do, the Golden Gate Bridge. And the man who is the head engineer, Strauss, the person that works for Strauss, underneath him, is Dixon's sister's husband. And Strauss doesn't like his current architect, and he doesn't like him. He can't get along with him. And so he lets him go, and he asks his assistant, who should we, hire? Who do you think's a good architect fit for this? And he says, well, ask Maynard Dixon. He'll know. Maynard says, okay, Irving Morrow. He does his houses. He's a young guy, but he really has very creative, a unique individual. I think you could work with him. So Strauss hires him. Irving Morrow says, okay, Dixon, I would like you to do all the drawings for the Golden Gate Bridge. So Dixon does these. In fact, on October 5th, they do this big editorial on passing this $35 million bond on October 5th, and he does all the drawings. He does everything to show what it looks like, and it passes. And then go forward to, I think it's March 5th, 1935. They're getting close now, finishing the bridge. Bridge opens in 37. 35, now they're deciding on the color of what to do for this bridge. And the bridge supervisors are looking at darker colors, black or gray. The Navy wants black with white stripes, And Dixon says, hey guys, you want this to be the wonder of the world? Well, you'd better not do that, because that's not going to be the wonder of the world. And I know a little bit about color and composition, and you need to leave it the color, that under-lead red paint that it is now. That'll fade with nature. It'll be fine. It'll be great over time, and it will be the wonder of the world. And in his final statement, and this he's writing to Irving Morrow, he wants Irving Morrow to know what he feels, and he's going to write the papers. He goes, I'm putting this in the papers, Dixon does. And he says, tell the supervisors not to try to be smarter than God. And so when you see that read, it's because of Dixon. And I think Dorothea as well. The family has always said it was them who were saying this should be this color. Now, it's attributed to Morrow, and of course, Morrow had a great deal of influence. So he takes this, all these letters and things into consideration. But Dixon does know color, right? He worked at as an advertising company for marketing and things from, Foster and Kleiser from 1916 to 1920. So he knows a lot about this kind of stuff. So that's when you think of the Golden Gate Bridge, you think of that red, think about Maynard Dixon.
Well, you're saying red, but it's
a burnt orange.
The actual name is International Orange,
that's
right?
Correct. Yeah.
And
that was the undercolor.
Wow.
Yeah.
How was he on site while they were building it? Was he doing anything?
I have no idea. My guess is I doubt it. Mm-hmm. He did his job like any illustrator. He sees the vision helicopter white, and he sees it from above, how it will look. He does what he does. He wants to get the job. He does the boardroom drawings that he wants to put in there, but they never do that. But he does all the drawings for it, and those are in my museum. The letter that he wrote Morrow is in the museum. The newspaper articles from October 5th, 1930 are in the museum. So, you can come to, when I say my museum, my Maynard Dixon Museum, and you can look and see that, what happened in that time frame. But, was he on the site? Well, he lived in San Francisco, so I'm sure he went by and saw it. I mean, it was a major project that went on they built it for 5 years and didn't open until 37. So,
Maynard Dixon is so connected to the Southwest. He'd made important trips to Arizona, to Utah, where he also had a home. Important trips, as we've talked about in past issues of our magazines, important trips in Nevada. But when did it really start? Have you pegged kind of when did his fascination with the Southwest, specifically Arizona, Utah area, when did that begin?
Yeah. So for Arizona, it's 1900. So if you think about, he's in San Francisco. He just quits Hearst, working as an advertising. You have the bluebonnet plague, it comes in through Hawaii in, I think, March of 1900. And you're starting to get these cases of plague. That's not a good thing. It killed a third of the world's population. And so I think that bothers him a lot and thinks this is a good time for me to get out of here. So in June of that time frame, 1900, he goes and sees llamas. In fact, he sees them and sits under their big sycamore and they have a talk. And Dixon says, I think I need to go east to see the West to really understand it. And he goes, yeah, you do. So kind of following Lummis's lead of where he should go, he goes on this trip to Arizona. And he leaves in like July of 1900. And he goes over and he stays with a guy named Ben Spear. So very interesting guy. He's an old trader. He's been there since the 1860s. He takes over the Mojave trading. So in Mojave, in that area, there was an old military base, and that was there in 1859. Spears opens a trading post there in 1890. Dixon shows up in 1900, and he says, oh yeah, you can go here, here, and here. You can go see all of Arizona. And he does that. So Dixon gets his first look at, the Apaches, and that type of thing. And then from 1900, that time frame, then he goes up, following the Lummises, and goes to Isleta. And I have some of those drawings in my museum of Isleta. He runs out of money, and he wires Loomis, I'm out of money. And so Loomis actually gives him money and comes out there, and then Dixon goes all the way up to Santa Fe. So that's the first time he goes west, goes east to see, the real West, and that's Arizona, New Mexico. And he'll continue to do that. 1902, he goes there. 1901, he takes this big long trip with Edward Breen. They go 1,000 miles. They start in May 6th from Oklahoma, 6 horses. They go all the way up, seeing Northern California, seeing Oregon, Idaho. Finally, they want to get to Montana, but the horses break down. They got to go back. So that's 1901. 1903, he goes to Arizona. 1904, he goes to Arizona. 1905, he goes to Arizona. 1906, he goes to Arizona. 1907, he goes to Arizona again, and then ends up in New York for a period of time. Then he heads out to Montana in 1909, and he just keeps seeing these places. He goes pretty much everywhere in the West and sees about 25 different tribes in his career. So, and it's just a nonstop thing. He's really traveling a lot through his life. 1933 is when he first goes to Utah. That's their first time. He gets to Nevada in 1902. I believe is when his first trip was in.
20 years between them?
No.
More than 20 years. I'm sorry, did I hear those dates wrong?
So, no, he went to Nevada much earlier than he goes to Utah. He goes in 1905, he goes to Tonopah to cover the miners that are having, the mining thing going on. And when he gets there, like 30 guys had just died from some kind of influenza. And so he's like, I'm sure very worried about that as well. But so, he hits all these different places. The 3 states, really the 4 states, really I think Dixon feels are his home. California, obviously, right? He's there for the most time. That's his birth home. That's where he lives. But he loves Nevada. He loves Utah, and he loves Arizona. He loves New Mexico too, but he just didn't get enough time there. He's only there one time, really, which is 1931. He gets there in like July 10th, and he stays until January 15th of 1932. And he's there for 7 months with Dorothea and with his 3 children. And he has a great time, does a lot of his great work. And he says in a letter that he writes, he goes, I was a fool not to come here and stay longer. I'll be back. But he doesn't. You have the Great Depression, and life moves on.
I want to talk about the Great Depression, but while we're on the topic of him traveling, what was travel like? I imagine some of his later trips were by car. But some of those 1902 things, I can only imagine were partly by train and then by horse and wagon, right?
Yeah, a lot of horse and wagon. Even in 1915, when he goes up to see the Apache reservation, he goes with a mail wagon. So yeah, he does cars. He hates cars. He wrecked a car going and broke his jaw, I think, when he was going and sprained his wrist going to New Mexico. because he's looking out the window the whole time. So he doesn't like cars. Usually he'll let somebody else drive. Dorothea or Edith would drive. But yes, I mean, he goes in Mexico. He goes down to Guadalajara with Xavier Martinez by train, but he uses horses. Marine, that whole trip is by horses. So he uses all modes of transportation. He goes to Hopi in 1923 by train on Anita Baldwin's train. She's one of the richest women in the world. So, he would take whatever was available, but a lot of times it was, hard scrabble kind of. I mean, we're talking, 1900. Arizona's not a state, New Mexico's not a state. Cayenne is the most remote town in America.
Probably. Right.
It is. It was. He visits it in 1922 with Dorothea Lange. He stays there for 4 months. At Weatherall's trading post, just chilling and going all the different places and being in the mode with the Dene and with the land. So, he traveled, however he could get around.
Before we go to the Depression, you mentioned earlier, like he wasn't interested in the Old West, the gunfights and all that stuff.
Correct.
He kind of has an introspective sort of, his work is very introspective. It's about the beauty of the place.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get those sort of sensationalized images of cowboys firing guns or Native Americans attacking the wagon train. You don't see that. Seems like that was a conscious decision. He did not want to do that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When you think about him, he loves history. He loves those individuals that were involved in that. I mean, he knows Buffalo Bill, right? He meets him in 1908. So when you're with Bill Cody, a man whose son is named after Kit Carson because he knows Kit Carson, and his best friend from childhood is Wild Bill Hickok, he would have had some very interesting conversations and learn about the Old West. And Wyatt Earp got married on Baldwin's ship, Lucky Baldwin's ship, who Dixon knows and does a drawing of, so he would have talked to him. So he would have had all these interactions. He had another friend who knew Pat Garrett. He knew those things, but that's not today, right? He doesn't want to be reliving those old things. Now, they're still very valuable, those illustrations and things that he did, but those are mainly in his earlier career. He tries to quit doing it by 1912. That's when he says, I'm, an artist in 1912. But what he's interested in is the land, America, and he is very interested in Native American subjects, but he tries to capture them as today, right? I mean, he's very involved in trying not to allow children. He thought that Indian school systems was terrible for Native Americans. He lived with them, right? He lives with some of these for as long as 6 months. So he had a good sense of who the people were. So he's not trying to do, as you say, cowboys and Indian kind of stuff. People like Charlie Russell, who he really respects, what he thought Charlie Russell did was represent the West. So he shows a historical representation. Dixon feels he interprets the West. He even says this in his 1924 card that for the California State Library, he's an interpreter of the West. That's a big difference because he sees it in a broader stroke, whether it's contemporary or whatever. And, he even says in that card, the titles of what I've done are superfluous. This is who I am. This is what I do, and he's very interested in the land. He's very interested in clouds and the indigenous individuals, both Native and Hispanic, that are in those areas, and cowboys too. They're part of the whole milieu. So if it's something that's real, like cowboys, the ones he shows, those are from his Marine trip in 1901 when he sees real cowboys breaking horses. So they're going to be real, individuals that he sees, not some, regurgitation of the old stories, which he knows. When he's with Ben Spears, right, 1900, that guy's been around there for 40 years. He's telling him all the real way it was. And Dixon loves that. He wants to understand it and know it, but he also wants to experience what's really going on. When he does his portraits often of Native people, he puts their name in their native language. That says it all.
He was certainly a sensitive painter, aware of what his models were doing and sort of the cultural impact of what he was doing. Let's talk about the Depression pieces he did. I know that we've talked about it before. You have a couple of these. The BYU Museum of Art has a really great collection. What about? And obviously, he might have been out of work at that time. But what was it that drew him to the sort of those social realism paintings that he did during the Depression? And maybe you can describe a couple of what they look like.
Yeah. So Dorothea Lange, to answer you, is the reason he's doing this, right? I mean, she's very interested in, and she's pushing him. She even says in an interview near the end of her life that I didn't push Maynard hard enough. I should have. He could have been even greater. She says that. So I'm sure she's pushing him on that. She sees what's going around. As far as, the Depression, we do have probably the largest number of Depression era drawings in private hands. BYU has the best collection by far. And the reason they have this is because in June of 1937, a man named Harold Clark, who was part of BYU, he was, I think, the dean of business, he fell in love with Dixon's pieces, specifically his Depression era pieces. He sees them in a St. Louis newspaper, these Depression eras, and he recognizes how important these are, and he contacts him. He says, let me buy these. And so Dixon does. He sells 85 paintings for $3,700, including Pickett's and all these great masterpieces, Nowhere to Go and things that are in the Brigham Young BYU's collection. And part of that was Dixon didn't want those to end up in a person like Hearst's collection. He really didn't want them in there. He was afraid that was going to happen. So he wanted it. I think he literally would have rather made less money to have it in the public domain, which he did. So to get back to the Depression part, how does this all happen, right? So he just does this big mural for the Biltmore Hotel. He does it in 1929. He's supposed to, and it's like 8 by 16 feet. Still there, still in the Biltmore. You can still go see it. It's the Legend of Earth and Sky. It's fantastic. We have the drawing for it. We have the drawing for that one and the one that his wife did, Edith, in 1948. But he's supposed to, he finished this as a major, important mural. October 24th, stock market crashes for the next 5 days. Everything changes, right? Everything changes. He's going to, at this point, there's just no work. So now he's like looking for things like the Golden Gate. He does some illustrations for Standard Oil. You're doing whatever you can do. All his galleries are saying, send us small stuff, and you need to lower the prices. That's what they're saying. And he's like, okay, because he's only going to sell, again, a couple dozen in this next 5 years. So the Depression hits hard. What does he do? Well, he gets depressed, and he does a painting called Shapes of Fear, originally called Ghost People, which had a central, so it's these robed figures with a central female who was nude. It was on the cover of a magazine. He didn't like it. It didn't work, and he got rid of it. He destroyed it, and he does Shapes of Fear. He enters it in 1931 in the San Francisco Academy of Arts. He's competing against people like Glackens and Hopper, Diego Rivera, Lucas, all these Dustberg. He wins the best prize for the most popular prize at that time. And Dixon goes, you had to be an analyst to be on that for judging. And he's talking about all these other people, that are doing modern art. The reality of that painting is it shows these figures that are draped, headless figures draped in blankets and these dark, somber grays and blues. That painting's in the Smithsonian. And Dixon at that time, he goes, when I was painting it, I felt a vice around my neck. So he wins the Harold Mack Award in 1931. He enters it into the National Academy of Design, the 107th National Academy of Design, and he wins the Henry Ranger Award, which gets him $1,500 as the best painting, basically, in America at that time. That's what it was. And that $1,500, he says, it saved my life. And that painting ends up in the Smithsonian. So he's doing this great stuff, but it's of this Depression things that he's feeling emotionally. And so Mabel Dodge Lujan, she offers him a place in New Mexico. So come out, I'll give you a studio, come paint. And, he wants to go to New Mexico. So he and Dorothea and the kids, they all go, they take a car, they go over, they get there July 10th to New Mexico, and he's going to stay for 7 months. Paints some of his most amazing paintings. And these are not Depression era paintings. These are Earth Knower, Men of Red Earth, Silent Hour, Allegory, all these great New Mexico paintings. He comes back in January of 1932. And what does he see? He sees the Forgotten Men, the Exodus. They're all heading to California. And directly after that, the Dust Bowl will happen. And there'll be another resurgence of all these individuals coming to California. And it affects him. He sees it. And he knows, that the world's in trouble as far as he can see it. Comes back, you have the dock strike, you have all these things that go on. He goes to Boulder Dam in 1934. He gets a PWA scholarship to go out there. It's the precursor for the WPA. He makes 10 cents, basically 10%, 10 cents on the dollar. And he does all these images. And what does he see? Well, he sees men cracking rocks, climbing these massive, wires. He does things like Men Are Tired, a great painting. He does some pieces that are Men Against Rock, Catwalk, all these things. He doesn't see it, but 4 people die when he's there in a month. Dorothea's brother, Martin, who's an erudite, working manual labor. And he says, I can't get to know these people. I'm living with them and I don't understand, what their lives are like. So that's when he comes back from that thing in April of 34. Right then, the dock strike happens. San Francisco's pandemonium. And so he starts doing all these depression, these social realism things. He quits doing paintings as far as landscapes and stuff. And that's really Dorothea and him trying to maybe fight back in their own way. Because when you're doing these images of men beating up men, like in scabs or pickets and these different things, those aren't going to sell. Especially in the Depression, nobody wants to see those. So he's doing it for a different reason. And he's going to do that through their divorce in 35. He's going to marry Edith. And he's going to do another trip in 39 through those migrant camps in Southern California. And he does this, I think, trying to maybe keep Dorothea's life, this fire that she's gotten him, alive. And he does some great things. And the newspapers write out to Dixon. They go, are you going to be the next John Steinbeck? Because Grapes of Wrath dropped in April of that year in 39. He wins, the Booker Prize. He wins Pulitzer. Dixon goes, I don't know. He's equivocal. He doesn't know. He doesn't know if he's going to be that guy. He doesn't know. He doesn't know where he's at. The reality is that was that last trip of really doing the Depression era kind of things, is that 1939 trip. And I think he realizes that point, I got to get out of San Francisco. My health's failing. He has his big, studio sale in 1939, October 12th. 13th.
We've talked about this. It was so big that they put it in the newspaper. It was covered in the local press, how he was leaving and selling everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's October 12th, 13th, and 14th. You could go from I think 3 in the afternoon till 9 at night, and buy illustrations, drawings, and everything and Native American stuff at bargain prices, because he wants to raise money to get out of there. And he ends up raising $7,500 so he can move to Arizona. And there's a little drawing in my museum of him on a horseback with a cigarette, kind of riding off into the distance. So he knows at that point he's gonna quit doing this Depression stuff. He's got a new wife and he wants to get back to doing landscapes. And where does he go? Arizona and Utah.
You mentioned the self-portrait. He did a lot of self-portraits, and
a few.
He seems to have had an impression of what he looked like. They're almost caricatures.
Often, almost always.
Yeah, they're fun though.
Yeah.
And I guess I tee that up to, what kind of person do you think he was? Was he a funny guy? Was he a hothead? Was he? What was he like? What was his disposition?
Yeah, it was super smart, very sensitive, and also I do think he had a very good sense of humor. No doubt about it. Now you look at those portraits in our museum, there's a lot that are kind of, like you said, self-effacing, showing him as this spider guy, real thin, running naked with his boots and stuff. But then you look at the big portrait that he did, that was done for the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1940. They went around, the president, they went and got all the great artists. They wanted to use them for the encyclopedia. They wanted examples. So Dixon doesn't give them a painting or a landscape. He does one of himself. which I find fascinating.
Did they use it?
Yeah, I guess they must have.
Yeah.
You know, I bought it from someone that I think they were the heirs of the Encyclopedia Britannica 20 years or 25 years ago.
You know, we were talking about some of the big paintings. You rattled off a bunch. There's so many that people have said. I mean, he made many masterpieces. Is there one that stands out to you?
You know, Earth Knower probably. I mean, that's a great one, 1931 that he did. You know, it's an amazing piece. It's the Oakland Art Museum, Oakland Museum of California Art, they call it now. That's a great one. The one that's hanging right now in our museum, the Wild Horses of Nevada, 1927, 28. You know,
It's really
42
nice.
by 50. I mean, that's an amazing piece. Yeah, there's some. I mean, he didn't do that many huge paintings really. In his log, there's like 18 major paintings that are still in existence.
The one that always surprises me, and I think surprises people who know his work, Cloud World, which
Yeah.
people love to death,
Yeah.
how small it is. It's not a big painting.
You know, it's probably 3 by 5 feet.
Well, am I thinking of the wrong one? I thought it was just like 40 inches.
No, it's bigger. I don't know exactly the dimensions. It's fairly big. It might be less than 5. It might be 48 inches. But yeah, it's not huge.
Right.
Yeah. No, it isn't. But powerful.
Yeah.
That's all. And most people would put that up as one of his great ones too. That's 1925. You know, and Pony Boy.
I was
You
just
know,
gonna. I'm
1920.
so partial to Pony Boy.
Yeah, I mean, how can you not love Pony Boy? I mean, it's it's an amazing piece.
Something about that pose that
Yeah. So it's
Pony Boy has, just sort of that relaxed pose, leaning
Yeah,
backward. It's
and
such
it's
a nice composition.
and also a big painting. It was Catherine Haley, you know, had it and she sold it, and I was there at that auction, and then it sold again.
You have a piece in the museum now, and it seems like it maybe is a precursor to Pony Boy. And I forget the name of it. It's Bull is in
Yeah,
the
it's
name.
Lone Bull.
Lone Bull.
Mhm,
Is that
1918.
are those paintings linked?
So, I mean, he does Pony Boy, you know, 3 years after that. So I'm sure that there is some kind of sensibility there. That painting was done in 1918. Dixon has just got back from Montana. He does that for a restaurateur. And, you know, it's a great painting. It's just this wonderful, Joe Coppa is who he does it for. And it's a wonderful painting. Are they linked? Hard to know. I mean, there's definitely a sensibility
Right.
that they both have, no doubt.
Mark, I just looked at the time on this, and we've talked. It's flown past because it's so fascinating hearing you talk about Dixon and just knowing everything. You know, for our listeners, and I guess they'll see this on the video that you've shot. You have no notes. You just know.
Yeah.
You know all this.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know.
All the dates, all the paintings, all this. You're an Encyclopedia Britannica on Dixon.
Sometimes I feel like I'm channeling this guy. You know, he lives in Tucson. You know, he dies there. It's at 2255 East Prince Road. I mean, out my window in my house is, you know, the paintings that he painted of the Catalina Mountains. I see the same thing. So, yeah, I mean, I find him very interesting and intriguing. And, you know, maybe that brings us to the point of, you know, a museum that I make for him. You know, and we've had a museum in the gallery for 20 plus years, right? But I felt there was a time and the opportunity happened that there was a perfect space next to my gallery here in Tucson. So a large space that I could dedicate it just to not only Maynard Dixon, which I did, which I reproduced his studio at, you know, 728 Montgomery Street from about 1915 timeframe, but it's also a Native American museum, which I like the concept that, you know, here you have a man who really did appreciate Native arts. I mean, if he could, he would have just, I think, been a dealer in those. I found a letter recently talking about how much he loves, you know, Navajo jewelry and, you know, Navajo blankets and rugs. So to have them together, I think, is a wonderful thing to have. And then we have a permanent exhibit of Ed Mell's work, who is often compared to Dixon. And Ed had, when he was alive, he had at least 2 shows, one with Dewey Gallery, which is a fantastic show, and there's an old catalog, and then we did one as well back maybe in the early 2000s. So in that museum, we also have a room that allows us to do exhibitions. So right now we have Dennis Semensky's, and for those who are listening to it and going, what date is this, right? So, you know, we're sitting here December 6th of 2024. So if you're listening to this 10 years later, this show's not on. But Dennis Semensky is this wonderful illustrator. You know, we're doing all his illustrations, next to Maynard Dixon's. And so we'll have different shows that relate to either Maynard Dixon or Native American art as well. That will every 3 to 4 months. It'll always be changing. So it just gives us again another extra thing to enjoy and to explore. And the money that we take in, because we do charge to get into at least the Maynard Dixon and Native American part, not the exhibits, that all goes to our foundations for the arts, which we try to give back to different types of organizations like SWI and other things. So that's kind of, it just opened, and we're going to be there for a while. Hopefully people will come and visit us. I hope they do.
We've had it in the magazine. I got to do my first tour of it today. Yep. It is gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. I am so excited for you. I can't wait for people to get down here and see it. Certainly our readers in our magazines, but also our listeners on our podcast. As we can, and I want to get to the book just a little bit. I want to plug the book and the museum some more as we're leaving out. But just kind of as a final thought, we in the Western world know Dixon very well, and we can talk probably for a whole other hour about all of the artists that were influenced by Maynard Dixon. But I think your thesis on Maynard Dixon is, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's not just a great Western painter. He's a great American artist, and he's an important American artist.
Yep. I agree. I mean, often you'll hear people say, I've heard this coined maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, he's the Hopper of the West. And if you look at those paintings, especially like Abandoned Homestead, right, in 1933, they have this Hopper-esque sensibility. And Dixon knows Hopper. He works in 1947 Broadway Street where, you have Bellows and Hopper and Robert Henry. They're all there. So he knows these guys. He knows them well, and some of them are his friends. So he is an American painter who happens to have the subject matter of the West and Native American art. But yes, I think he transcends that. And I think most of the painters today, Western painters, would like to think that they're in that same category too. Some do these very contemporary design things, and some are very traditional and tight, but they all will probably say Maynard Dixon's one of their influences, which he would love. He would absolutely love that he had that kind of influence, because he was really wanted painters to embrace the concept of America and representing Americans' art as far as their environment and their landscape and the people. And, because he never went to Europe. I mean, the only closest thing he came to Europe was Arthur Matthews, who's teaching him, at school when he's 17 years old. But he's very aware of all the art. I mean, he's in the Pan Pacific in 1915 at that show where you have all these French Impressionists, and he's showing it, and he gets a bronze medal next to all these, wild things from Europe. I mean, he lives in New York for 5 years. He knows, that Eastern work. And he struggles with that. He struggles to, do I do any of this, or how do I, where is my role? And he's been called, in 1927, 28, he did like 25 shows across the country. And one of them was in Chicago. And in Chicago, they're saying, oh, he's the contemporary Western artist. And Dixon kind of laughs and says, back west, they call me the, buggy guy, horse and buggy. So he's trying to find that line of who he is. And you see these paintings like Cloud World and things like that, especially some of his later work, you can see that kind of modernist contemporary bent that so many artists today really can gravitate to, like an Ed Mell. Of course, Ed was, so many people influenced Ed, and he would be the first to say, yeah, I'm a lot of influences. So yeah, he's critically important as an American painter and an influence. And Dixon's one thing that he was the most proud of in his life was, he goes, I made a living as a painter my entire life. Yeah.
Well, you've done him justice here. I hope that our listeners, if they don't know Maynard Dixon, can go check him out. And those that do, I'm sure they learned a ton of new stuff. Thank you so much. Let's talk about a moment. If anyone wants to read more, they need to check out Mark's book, Maynard Dixon's American West, Along the Distant Mesa.
Yep.
This is 2 years old, I think. It's not that old.
It's older now.
Is it really?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost out of print, and I'm not reprinting it. So it's only maybe a couple hundred left. So
get one now. Bring a wheelbarrow because it's a big book. I think it might be one of the biggest books I have in my own personal library.
Yeah.
And then, of course, come by and see the Maynard Dixon Museum. And tell me the full title.
It's Maynard Dixon and Native American Art.
Yes. And that is in Tucson. It is right around the corner from your Mark Sublette Medicine Man Gallery. Mm-hmm. And is there anything else we should plug? Oh, Art Dealer Diaries.
Yeah.
Check out Art Dealer Diaries, where you can hear Mark talk about lots of other things, including with other artists who have certainly been influenced by Maynard Dixon.
And you, I've interviewed you.
Thank you. Yes. We're glad to have you back.
So, no, it's interesting because this is the first time I've ever been interviewed in my own studio. And now I realize why I like to be the host, because that's a lot of talking I just did.
Yeah.
And I've got an opening tonight.
Yeah. So that's some warm tea or with honey or something, right? Exactly. Is that the saying? Mark, thanks so much. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for taking the time, Michael.
And to our listeners, thank you for participating in our podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe and do all that good stuff. And we will catch you on the next episode. Thanks.